Hello, and my name is Tom Elpel, co-author of the book Foraging the Mountain West, Gourmet Edible Plants, Mushrooms, and Meat. Over the past few decades, we've all witnessed unprecedented disconnect from the natural world, as nature has largely been reduced to pretty scenery to look at out the window. And with this disconnect, we've seen rapidly deteriorating environmental conditions, with the real worry that our children may one day only know nature as a collection of artifacts to be viewed in a museum. If we are to have any hope of healing our world, we must first break through the glass and return to nature to nurture a deeper, more interactive connection with the world around us. And what better way to get started than to meet, greet, and eat the many edible wild plants that surround us. To get started, I'd like to share a little bit about my background and how I got started on this path. The credit really goes to my grandmother, Josie Jewett, who taught me many edible and medicinal plants when I was young and nurtured my interest in wilderness survival skills. I spent much of my youth out practicing survival basics, shelter, fire, water, food, and that really shaped my outlook as a young adult, realizing that we have the same basic needs in the modern world as we do when we're out camping. And so I saved up a small nest egg, bought land, moved into a tent, and built a passive solar stone and log house without a mortgage. Not having bills meant that I was able to pursue my own dreams in life, including the dream to become a writer. I have published numerous books, videos, and games on wilderness survival and sustainable living, as well as botany and foraging, including my best-known book, Botany in a Day, which has sold more than 130,000 copies worldwide. My newest book is titled 5 Months on the Missouri River, Paddling a Dugout Canoe, and it chronicles the experience of carving this beautiful canoe and leading a 5-man, 5-month expedition down the Missouri River from Three Forks, Montana to St. Louis, Missouri, on a journey of rediscovery to explore the land and its history at all points along the way. And I'm proud to say that I've won 3 awards for this book, including the Writer's Digest First Place Award for Nonfiction. And of course, spending that time on the river gave us ample time for opportunistic foraging along the way, which added a fun dimension to the experience. And at present, I am carving another dugout canoe with a group of students, and we are taking 10 months to make all Stone Age gear, from buckskin clothing to stone knives, for a Stone Age journey of 7 weeks and 540 miles down the Yellowstone River, doing a great deal of hunting and gathering along the way. And now, to get started with wild plant foraging, it is first critical to develop some background with plant identification. And I'd like to touch on that here with what I call the patterns method of plant identification. And that is simply that related plants have similar characteristics for identification, and they often have similar uses. For example, consider the patterns of the mint family. Most mints have very square stems and opposite leaves, and they're usually aromatic or minty smelling. There's more than 3,000 mints in the world, including many common spices that you would have at home, such as oregano, basil, thyme, marjoram, lavender, and culinary sage. And you can experiment with any of the wild mints that you encounter. So is this a flavor that you might want to use as tea, or to add as a spice to salad, or any dish that you might want to cook up? And so if you can memorize this basic pattern that the mints tend to have square stems, opposite leaves, and they're usually aromatic or minty smelling, then you have the ability to recognize thousands of plants in the mint family. And you don't necessarily need to know their individual names to be able to experiment with them, to taste them or smell them, to try them out as tea, or to add them to a salad or some dish that you're cooking up. And that's really a powerful ability to walk through the natural world and to instantly know something about a plant that you've never before encountered. And moving on to the mustard family, here is another simple pattern. The mustards have 4 petals, and there are a lot of plant families that have 4 petals. But the mustards also have 6 stamens. And that's the male part of the flower. That's easy to remember because they always stay men. There are 4 tall stamens and 2 short stamens. So if you find a flower with 4 petals and 6 stamens, 4 tall and 2 short, then you can be sure that you have a member of the mustard family. There are, again here, more than 3,000 species in the mustard family, and they're all edible. So if you find a flower like that, you don't necessarily need to know its name to be able to experiment with it, to taste it and decide, is this something that you might want to add to a salad? One of the cool things about learning plants this way is that you can lay out the basic patterns for identification to recognize more than 45,000 species of plants to their proper families with an introduction of only 5 to 10 minutes, and then memorize those through these fun card games. But the thing that really excites me is when kids come along who have completely missed the introduction, but just by watching other people play the card game, they can quickly hop in and recognize these families without consciously knowing why one plant belongs to a certain family rather than another. So there's one more plant family pattern I'd like to introduce right now, and that's the parsley family. And unlike the mint family or the mustard family, where you can experiment around with anything you encounter, the parsley family does include some great edible plants and medicinal plants, but also some of the most deadly plants in the world. So this is a case where when you see the pattern of the parsley family, you know you don't screw around with it. You have to know the individual plants. You have to be 100% certain about the plants that you are working with, and more than being certain, you have to be correct. So the pattern here is what we call a compound umbel. You'll notice that the flowers form in something that looks a little bit like an umbrella, or what botanists call an umbel. You have all of these little spokes radiating out from a central point, and it's compound because at the end of each one of those little spokes, there's another little umbel. So we have a compound umbel. If you have the compound umbel, you have a member of the parsley family. Now, plant families vary tremendously in size, whereas some families might have only one species, another might have tens of thousands of plants in it. But like the mints and the mustards, the parsleys have about 3,000 species. And as we flip through the cards, you can see just how obvious they are to recognize by this umbrella-like compound umbel that is diagnostic for the parsley family. As we move deeper into the foraging part of this presentation, I'd like to introduce my friend Kris Reed, who co-authored the book Foraging the Mountain West. Kris and I have been out on many great foraging adventures, walkabouts, and canoe trips. And this book would have never happened without Kris first roughing a lot of it out on paper and getting the job started. Anyone who gets into wild food foraging should become intimately familiar with some of the most deadly poisonous plants that you're likely to encounter. While there are many, many poisonous plants in the world, there's very few that are actually drop-dead poisonous. And water hemlock is one that you should know very well. Water hemlock can be recognized as a member of the parsley family by that cluster of white flowers that takes on that distinctive umbrella shape that we call a compound umbel. And the juice of this plant, especially the root, is extremely toxic. And just a small amount of that can send you into convulsions where you shred your tongue and pretty much die in agony. This is not a good way to go, and you do not want to mix this plant up with wild carrots or anything else. Water hemlock can be identified within the parsley family by the distinct pattern of veins within the leaves. Looking at the serrated margin of the leaf, most parsleys have veins that go only to the tips of the serrations, whereas in water hemlock they tend to go to the cut of the serration. So there's a saying, vein to the tip, totally hip, vein to the cut, pain in the gut. This is a plant you absolutely want to stay away from. Another deadly plant in the parsley family is poison hemlock, which you'll notice has more of a ferny leaf and typically purple spots on the stem. Whereas water hemlock has a neurotoxin that sends you into convulsions, poison hemlock is more of a neuroparalyzer that puts your body to sleep permanently. So if your time is up, this is definitely the preferred way to go. And this is the plant that was given to Socrates for his execution. Having taken the plant, he laid there and described for observers as he gradually lost sensation from his extremities, moving inwards towards his core, until he lost consciousness and died. Another deadly plant you should know is death camas, which consists of several species spread out over a few different genera. But all have creamy white or greenish white lily-like flowers and bulbs that grow in overlapping layers like an onion. These could be confused with any number of root crops that you might harvest. Reports of the toxicity varies considerably from one source to another, with some saying that it could take several bulbs to kill you, while others say that a single bulb in a pot might kill everybody that eats out of that pot. In actuality, toxicity probably varies considerably from one species to another, as well as from location to location, according to different soil types and seasonal fluctuations in the weather. Now, the reality is that there hasn't been any controlled tests to see exactly how many bulbs it takes to kill a person, probably for lack of volunteers, go figure. Well, there are a great many plants with toxic properties in the world. There are actually very few that are drop-dead poisonous, and most plants with toxic properties would require that you consume a significant quantity of them in order to do any real harm to yourself. But here's the thing, many edible plants may have some toxic properties, and when you start reading foraging books, you'll come into a lot of alarming statements such as these. The fruit is edible, but the leaves and seeds are poisonous. The leaves are toxic, however, the leaf stems may be eaten. The fleshy fruit is delicious, but the seeds contain cyanide. The starchy tuber is edible, however, the toxic green skin must be removed. Excess consumption of the raw nut could be fatal, but it is edible and choice when properly prepared. The spicy fruit is considered edible, but could cause nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain, and burning diarrhea if consumed in excess. So what do you think when you read these statements? Does it really make you want to go foraging, or maybe not? Well, here's the thing. These statements refer to plants as dangerous and deadly as the cherry, rhubarb, apple, potato, cashew, and hot pepper. These are plant foods that we eat every day, and we don't worry about dying. And so that's the thing about wild food foraging, is that many of the plants that have toxic properties are about as dangerous and deadly as eating an apple. So let's go ahead and dive into some wild edible spring greens. And you can see that Kris found a good one here. I'd like to start with the common cattail that is widespread across North America and such a terrific plant for beginning foragers to start with. I teach wilderness survival skills to public school kids, so we're out there really early in the spring in the swamps, getting those shoots when they're just popping out of the water, and we'll follow those down to the base and then pull them up to snap them off. And then they're easily prepared by, first of all, peeling off the outer layers that are more fibrous, and this also takes off any swamp water that's on the stalk. And then you can cut off the swampy base with a knife so that you have a clean cattail stalk. And you can eat it just like that, or chop it up for a salad. And then if it starts to get fibrous-y again, then just peel off the more of the outer layers there, and you get to more tender stalk, and you can go up as far as you can there, as far as it's tender. And it's such a delicious green to use in salads. Here we have a salad with cattail stalks, dandelion leaves, and blue camas flowers. Delicious. The starchy horizontal rhizomes are also edible and delicious and highly nutritious, just really packed with starch. And they're encased in kind of a foamy rind that you can peel off to reveal the starchy core, and you can use the dull backside of a knife to kind of squeegee out the starch to separate it from the fibers. It's a bit time consuming though, and if you're just going for calories, really you can just eat that starchy core either raw or roasted. And I like to eat it in one hand and have some berries in the other for some flavor, chew it up, and then just spit out the fibers. and you've got some good nutrition and lots of calories. Now the young green flower heads are also very edible, and it kind of looks like a couple of hot dogs on a stick. You have the male flower heads above and the female flowers below. And you can boil those in water and really put some butter on them, eat them just like corn on the cob. In this case, we have some screenshots from one of my wilderness survival videos where I'm cooking on a hot rock and scraping off the stamens to make a little bit of a base to basically keep from burning my food, but also cooking up some of those flower stalks there around the perimeter of the rock, and they're truly just delicious. So here's a plant that just about everybody knows already. And while there are some native species of dandelions, the one that you see everywhere is the common dandelion that's been imported from the Old World. And if you'll note the two leaves side by side here, that there's a lot of variation in the leaves, that sometimes they're pretty whole, while other times they're deeply indented from the sides. That is especially true, as we go hotter and drier into the seasons, that they tend to be more indented, having less surface area exposed to the sun. And as far as, when is the best time to get your dandelions, is some people find them to be bitter, and the way to avoid that is to harvest dandelions early in the springtime when they're growing faster and don't have that same kind of bitterness. Now, what I found, what a lot of people find, is that when you start adding dandelions to your meals, they don't seem bitter anymore, that you actually adapt to that very quickly. Looking at this salad here, this was actually on a canoe trip, and we collected a bunch of dandelion leaves, and then some of our crew actually hiked into a nearby town and went dumpster diving at the grocery store and rescued these tomatoes. So we had a nice dandelion tomato salad. And, you can also dry dandelions and powder it, make something kind of like parsley flakes that you just, because dandelions are so nutritious, you can just sprinkle that into any meal that you're cooking for some good nutrition. The fact that dandelions are so wildly abundant across so many different ecosystems makes them such an ideal green for any kind of wilderness outing. And, in the case of the Missouri River, I've talked to other paddlers who've not just eaten dry goods all the way down the river. But the exciting thing about knowing dandelions and other wild edible greens is that where you can't really pack something like that along in your food supply, you can add it to any meal. And in this case, just adding a few greens to a burrito. Dandelions are also such a great way to get kids involved and excited about nature and foraging for wild foods. You can take the flower heads and dip those in batter, just like pancake batter, and fry them up like little pancakes with a nutritional flour embedded in those. And it's fun for kids, give them more of a connection that is like planting a seed that can grow into a lifelong interest in learning more about nature. There's one choice edible on the dandelion is what we call the crown, and that is like the top section of the root with the bottom section of the stems, which are typically kind of blanched out in white instead of green, so really, they don't have any of that bitterness. And these are just delicious, fried up in a little bit of butter. And the roots, now you can clean them up and cook them, boil them as like a root vegetable. But the other thing you can do with those is to dry them, roast them, and then grind them and to make like basically a coffee substitute that is both delicious and nutritious. Now there are a great many plants and trees that have been introduced to North America from all over the world. And the Siberian elm is one of these that it has a reputation for being invasive in many states. Here in Montana, it seems to be less so. It tends to complement what's in our ecosystems more than to replace what's in our ecosystems. And the elms are easily identified. They have these sort of lopsided leaves where they're a little bit more bulbous at the base on one side than on the other. It's a very distinctive pattern for recognizing trees of the elm family. And where you might not, think of trees as food so much, they bloom, the Siberian elms bloom early in the spring before the leaves pop out. And the flowers produce these seeds that, while they're still green, before they turn dry and kind of papery with a hard seed, while they're still green, they're very tender and incredibly sweet. And you can just kind of like eat fistfuls of these as a salad. They are so delicious, and just, you know, something to really celebrate with this tree. Another common plant, which you might not think of as food, is the white clover. That's common, and just, you know, it's always underfoot. But pea family plants tend to be really high in proteins. And so white clovers can make a nice blended salad. In this case, we have clover leaves, clover flowers, dandelion leaves, as well as some yampa flowers that makes a salad that is as beautiful as it is nutritious. So here's a plant known as broadleaf plantain, often referred to as white man's footsteps because of the way that it followed European colonists. Wherever white people went to, the plant was sure to follow in short order. And like a lot of introduced species, it's not native, but it's also not really invasive. It just tends to blend into ecosystems rather than replace them. And it makes a great salad plant. The leaves are easy to recognize. They have these kind of strong veins in them that are nearly parallel, and if you kind of pull the leaf apart, the fibers in those veins will cling together, so you'll see the little string attaching the two parts of the leaf. So this salad is one that we made on the Missouri River trip, and in this case we just have plantain leaves, and then the flowers as a garnish actually came from silver cinquefoil, which is a plant from the rose family. Another thing I like to do with the plantain is just to batter fry the leaves, to take the leaves and to dip them in batter and fry them in oil. And of course, anything fried in oil is really good. Now here's a truly surprising wild edible, the Canada thistle. The Canada thistle isn't actually from Canada. It was introduced from Europe and Asia, where it is known as the creeping thistle because of the way the roots spread out horizontally and send up more plants. But somehow the name Canada thistle has become entrenched here in the US. And it's really one of the very first spring greens that you can get to. And if you harvest the leaves while they're young and not too stiff, then you can even put the leaves right on a sandwich, as you see here. And you will notice the spines in there, but it's not like an ouch. It's just like, yeah, they're there. And it's really interesting because when you just take and chop the thistle leaves up and blend it into a salad, then you really don't notice the spines at all. And we'll do this on our kids programs, where the kids will gather up and make a salad of Canada thistle and dandelions and cattails, mustard greens, whatever we can find in season, and chop it all up, mix it together. We'll add some croutons and salad dressing, and just have this big finger salad where everybody, reaches in and gets some, and the kids just really gobble it up, and it's exciting to see them kind of get involved in nature that way, that they're participating in the process of gathering the salad, and then they get to enjoy the reward of eating the salad. Now the nodding thistle, also known as the musk thistle, it gets its name, the nodding, because the flowers often hang over as they bloom. And in this case, the leaves are too spiny that you don't want to put those in your salad. But the flower stalk it can be fairly large, very tender, juicy, delicious. And so they're fairly easy to harvest. You just want to kind of wiggle the flower stems back and forth early in the season, really before they're starting to open up. And then you'll find that point where the stalks tends to stiffen, and cut it right there at that point, and then you can kind of peel off the outer rind on the thistle, peel off all the spiny rind and the leaves, and then you have this tender morsel, almost like celery, except more tender, more juicy, and more delicious. This plant is known as goosefoot, often referred to as lamb's quarters, in reference to the fact that it likes the manure-rich soils of barnyards. And I like the name goosefoot. As you can see, the individual leaves often have this like three-toed appearance, much like a goosefoot. And this particular plant is very closely related to spinach, and really used in substitution for it. So you can use it in salads, use it as a pot herb, or in this case, use it as a substitute for spinach in a quiche, and just super delicious. If you have a garden, then you probably have lamb's quarters or goosefoot in your garden, as well as many other edible weeds that are as delicious and nutritious as anything that you could grow. Now, Orache is a plant that could easily be confused with goosefoot, but no worries because the two are closely related and equally delicious. We often find great patches of Orache out on our canoe trips, and this is just a fantastic salad green and pot herb. Really a great plant. Now, we talked about the mustard family in general earlier, and I'd like to talk specifically about the Tumble Mustard here. And this is one of the plants that grows up to produce a tumbleweed that rolls across the landscape to scatter its seeds. The Tumble Mustard starts with a green rosette of spicy leaves, kind of looks like a snowflake on the ground really early in the springtime, and then grows up through the summer to produce a flower stalk before ultimately drying out to make a tumbleweed. And if you can catch those flower tops while they're young, preferably before they've even quite started to open up, it is just really an amazing green. It tastes like broccoli, which is also in the mustard family, but this would be better described as a spicy broccoli. So it's broccoli with a kick, but really delicious. And now I'd like to just briefly mention the wild asparagus, which is really not so wild at all. This is the same asparagus that we grow in our gardens. It has just escaped cultivation to grow out in the countryside. And you'll notice that its preferred habitat is really right along fence lines or just outside of fence lines, that it's fairly susceptible to livestock trampling, so it likes those little protected niches. And you can often identify it just driving down the road. You'll see the dead stalks from last year, which shows you where to look for the green stalks this year. And this is a plant that, there's a lot of people that forage for wild asparagus, and they may not know any other plants, but they're really excited about wild asparagus. And this is something that we really need to look at ways of, how can we increase the amount of wild asparagus out there for budding foragers. My purpose in introducing the wild asparagus is as a lead-in to talking about our native showy milkweed. This is a plant that tastes exactly like asparagus when it's cooked up. It's a delicious wild edible green that's fairly widespread, but also greatly endangered due to indiscriminate herbicide use. Now, you have to be careful with harvesting milkweed because they actually look very similar to dogbane, which is toxic. Both plants have erect stems with opposite leaves and are just abundant milky juice in the stems. There are some differences, though, that the milkweed leaves tend to be a little bit more thicker and fuzzier. Dogwood stems tend to be a little bit more, slick, and the stems tend to be redder. However, milkweed and dogbane grow in such similar niches that they often be patches just a couple feet away from each other. And in this case, you can see that we have a milkweed and a dogbane side by side, and in this case, they look almost identical. The showy milkweed is aptly named for the beautiful flowers that come out in midsummer. And monarch butterflies are completely dependent on milkweeds as a food source early in their larval stage before they metamorphose into butterflies. And so, what we're seeing is as milkweed populations crash due to misuse of herbicides, so too are the monarch butterfly populations. And if we want to bring back our monarchs, we also need to bring back our milkweeds. So this is really the essence of being a forager, is that you're not just taking from the land, but you're also looking for ways to give back. And I actually just planted a new milkweed patch this last week, and hoping to create more habitat for. And milkweed seed pods are also edible and delicious if you can find milkweeds that are abundant enough to justify harvesting some. You need to harvest them while they're still young and tender before they get too fibrous inside, but then just boil them up as a green and you'll find them to be delicious. Now here is a photo from our Missouri River trip when we intersected a monarch migration out in South Dakota. And these little butterflies had stopped in the trees for the night to rest. And it was pretty amazing to think that these little guys were headed to Mexico and that they would get there faster than we would get to St. Louis. Another one of our great native plants is the chokecherry. And this was a big part of my life growing up, that we were always up harvesting chokecherries in late summer and early fall. My mother made chokecherry syrup, my grandmother made syrup, and she made chokecherry wine. And that's all great, but with my interest in survival skills, I was kind of disappointed in chokecherry because it's just like juice, and I'm thinking for my stomach and I want something with more substance to it. But I finally learned about the native way of processing chokecherries through a Crow Indian elder, Alma Snell. It showed me how the native peoples would crush up the chokecherries with a rock. And so pounding up that pit inside the fruit. And cherries and almonds are super closely related. And so there's an almond-like aroma there to that pit. That's also indicative of a cyanide content. But cyanide breaks down easily in the presence of heat and oxygen. So you can crush up the chokecherries, form them into patties, dry them in the sun, and you have these delicious cherry almond energy bars. And the thing is, you have to be a little cautious because it does have the pit shells broken up in there, so you don't want to chip a tooth on it. So you tend to eat them a little bit carefully, and it's kind of a self-limiting, you don't gorge yourself on these just because you have to eat them a little bit more slowly. But Alma had showed me the official native way of doing this was to make these cherry almond patties and then to cover those with chocolate and toast them in the oven for cherry almond chocolates. I'd like to touch briefly on the subject of foraging ethics. You see, we come from a culture with a sequential worldview of linear cause and effect. So when we go out foraging, it's seen as a one-way relationship with nature where we're taking, and that's often frowned upon. But nothing could be farther from the truth. And I'd like to look at bears as a comparison here, because if you look at the way bears harvest chokecherries, for example, they'll go up and they'll grab the tree branches and bend them over until they break. They strip off all the fruits they want. They leave a big mess and then they walk off. And by the standards of our culture, bears are the worst. They should be banned from foraging. But here's the reality, is that when the bears walk off, they poop out chokecherries, and new trees will sprout from that bear poop and be enhanced by the fertilizer in the bear poop. And you'll be surprised how common you'll see these little chokecherries sprouting from bear piles. And so it's actually a cyclical relationship that the bears are planting the very chokecherries that they're harvesting. And that's really the goal that we all strive towards as foragers. And it's especially important in this world of climate change, where the zones that plants used to grow in may not be habitable for them, where they could be dependent on assisted migration to get to new zones that are habitable. So that's really what we all need to strive for as foragers, is to help spread those seeds around and to create greater abundance in the world for all. And with that, I'd like to thank you for joining me today for this introductory look at plant identification and foraging. To continue the journey, be sure to check out our book, Foraging the Mountain West, Gourmet Edible Plants, Mushrooms, and Meat. And finally, I would like to invite you to join me for my next 2-week Botany and Foraging Intensive as we travel the West and dive deep into plant identification, wild food foraging, and ecology. And in the meantime, be sure to check out my Botany in a Day tutorial on YouTube.